The Lady and the Merman, The White Seal Maid, The Fisherman's Wife, by Jane Yolen. One of the most distinguished of modern fantasists, Jane Yolen has been compared to writers such as Oscar Wilde and Charles Perrault, and has been called the Hans Christian Andersen of the 20th century. Primarily known for her work for children and young adults, Yolen has produced more than 60 books, including novels, collections of short stories, poetry collections, picture books, biographies, and a book of essays on folklore and fairy tales. She has received the Golden Kite Award and has been a finalist for the National Book Award. Her books include the novel The Magic Three of Solatia and the collections Dreamweaver, Moon Ribbon, The Girl Who Cried Flowers, and The 100th Dove. Her most recent work is the collection Tales of Wonder, her 70th book. Yolen has probably written more about mermaids and other undersea folk than any other contemporary fantasist. The theme seems to hold a powerful fascination for her, and she has returned to it again and again throughout her career, examining the lives of the merfolk from every conceivable angle. Many of these stories were collected in her book, Neptune Rising, Songs and Tales of the Undersea Folk, from which 2 of the present selections were taken. Here, then, is a triptych of Jane Yolen's vivid and elegant stories of the merfolk, The Lady and the Merman, The White Seal Maid, and The Fisherman's Wife, in which we meet some strange and magical creatures indeed, human and otherwise. The Lady and the Merman, by Jane Yolen. Once in a house overlooking the cold northern sea, a baby was born. She was so plain, her father, a sea captain, remarked on it. "She shall be a burden," he said. "She shall be on our hands forever." Then, without another glance at the child, he sailed off on his great ship. His wife, who had longed to please him, was so hurt by his complaint that she soon died of it. Between one voyage and the next, she was gone. When the captain came home and found this out, he was so enraged he never spoke of his wife again. In this way, he convinced himself that her loss was nothing. But the girl lived and grew as if to spite her father. She looked little like her dead mother, but instead had the captain's face set round with mouse-brown curls. Yet as plain as her face was, her heart was not. She loved her father, but was not loved in return. And still the captain remarked on her looks. He said at every meeting, "God must have wanted me cursed to give me such a child. No one will have her. She shall never be wed. She shall be with me forever." So he called her Born, for she was his burden. Born grew into a lady, and only once gave sign of this hurt. "Father," she said one day when he was newly returned from the sea, "what can I do to heal this wound between us?" He looked away from her, for he could not bear to see his own face mocked in hers, and spoke to the cold stone floor. "There is nothing between us, daughter," he said, "but if there were, I would say, salt for such wounds." "Salt?" Born asked, surprised, for she knew the sting of it. "A sailor's balm," he said, "the salt of tears, or the salt of sweat, or the final salt of the sea." Then he turned from her and was gone the next day to the farthest port he knew of, and in this way he cleansed his heart. After this, Born never spoke again of the hurt. Instead, she carried it silently, like a dagger inside, for the salt of tears did not salve her, so she turned instead to work. She baked bread in her ovens for the poor. She nursed the sick. She held the hands of the sea widows. But always, late in the evening, she walked on the shore, looking and longing for a sight of her father's sail. Only less and less often did he return from the sea. One evening, tired from the work of the day, Born felt faint as she walked on the strand. Finding a rock half in and half out of the water, she climbed upon it to rest. She spread her skirts about her, and in the dusk they lay like great grey waves. How long she sat there, still as the rock, she did not know. But a strange pale moon came up, and as it rose, so too rose the little creatures of the deep. They leaped free for a moment of the pull of the tide, and last of all, up from the depths, came the merman. He rose out of the crest of the waves, sea foam crowning his green-black hair. His hands were raised high above him, and the webbings of his fingers were as colorless as air. In the moonlight he seemed to stand upon his tail. Then, with a flick of it, he was gone back to the deeps. He thought no one had remarked his dive. But Born had. So silent and still, she saw it all, his beauty and his power. She saw him and loved him, though she loved the fish half of him more. It was all she could dare. She could not tell what she felt to a soul, for she had no one who cared about her feelings. Instead, she forsook her work and walked by the sea both morning and night. Yet, strange to say, she never once looked for her father's sail. That is why her father returned one day without her knowing it. He watched her through slotted eyes as she paced the shore, for he would not look straight upon her. At last he went to her and said, "Be done with it. Whatever ails you, give it over." For even he could see this wound. Born looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with small seas. Grateful even for this attention, she answered, "Yes, father, you are right. I must be done with it." The captain turned and left her then, for his food was growing cold. But Born went directly to the place where the waves were creeping onto the shore. She called out in a low voice, "Come up. Come up and be my love." There was no answer except for the shrieking laughter of the birds as they dove into the sea. So she took a stick and wrote the same words upon the sand for the merman to see should he ever return. Only, as she watched, the creeping tide erased her words one by one. Soon there was nothing left of her cry on that shining strand. So Born sat herself down on the rock to weep, and each tear was an ocean. But the words were not lost. Each syllable washed from the beach was carried below, down, down, down to the depths of the cool, inviting sea. And there, below on his coral bed, the merman saw her words and came. He was all day swimming up to her. He was half the night seeking that particular strand. But when he came, cresting the currents, he surfaced with a mighty splash below Born's rock. The moon shone down on the two, she a grave shadow perched upon a stone, and he all motion and light. Born reached down with her white hands, and he caught them in his. It was the only touch she could remember. She smiled to see the webs stretched taut between his fingers. He laughed to see hers webless, thin and small. One great pull between them, and he was up by her side. Even in the dark, she could see his eyes on her under the phosphorescence of his hair. He sat all night by her, and Born loved the man of him as well as the fish then, for in the silent night it was all one. Then, before the sun could rise, she dropped her hands on his chest. "Can you love me?" she dared to ask, at last. But the merman had no tongue to tell her about the waves. He could only speak below the water with his hands, a soft murmuration. So, wordlessly, he stared into her eyes and pointed to the sea. Then, with the sun just rising beyond the rim of the world, he turned, dove arrow slim into a wave, and was gone. Gathering her skirts, now heavy with ocean spray and tears, Born stood up. She cast but one glance at the shore and her father's house beyond. Then she dove after the merman into the sea. The sea put bubble jewels in her hair and spread her skirts about her like a scallop shell. Tiny colored fish swam in between her fingers. The water cast her face in silver, and all the sea was reflected in her eyes. she was beautiful for the first time and for the last.